A country of 40 million people just triggered a chain reaction that is reshaping alliances, rerouting global trade, and forcing every major power on Earth to pick a side. And the United States, the country that started all of this, has no idea how to stop it. This is not an exaggeration. What Canada did and what has followed from it is one of the most consequential geopolitical pivots of the 21st century. And it happened so fast and so quietly in certain corridors that most of the world is only now beginning to understand what just moved underneath them. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will see why historians may one day point to Canada's decision, not China, not Russia, not any traditional rival, as the moment the American-led global order began its most fundamental transformation. For 75 years, the relationship between the United States and Canada was treated as one of the fixed points of the modern world. The two countries shared the longest undefended border on the planet. They fought wars together, built intelligence networks together, wove their economies into something so tightly integrated that pulling them apart would be like separating the threads of a single fabric. Canada bought more from the United States than the United Kingdom, France, China, and Japan combined. Nearly 3/4 of Canadian exports flowed south across that border every year. The two countries were not just allies. They were economically and strategically each other's most important relationship on Earth. That was the world before February 1st, 2025. What happened after that date is what this video is about. On that day, President Trump signed an executive order imposing 25% tariffs on virtually all Canadian imports, with a 10% rate on Canadian energy. The stated justification was a national emergency caused by fentanyl flowing across the border from Canada. There was one problem with that justification: it was not supported by the facts. According to U.S. Customs data, less than 1% of fentanyl seized at American borders came from Canada. The drug flowed almost entirely from the southern border. Canada was not the fentanyl source, it was a convenient legal pretext, and every trade lawyer, economist, and foreign ministry analyst in the world read it that way. Canada's initial response was swift. Ottawa announced retaliatory tariffs on 30 billion Canadian dollars worth of American goods, with a commitment to escalate to 155 billion within 3 weeks if the U.S. tariffs held. Liquor shelves across Canadian provinces pulled American products. Government procurement offices audited every American contract. Provinces canceled deals with American suppliers. Ontario, the most economically powerful province in Canada, canceled a $100 million Starlink contract with Elon Musk's company the week the tariffs landed. These were symbolic acts, mostly, the kind of political signaling that trade disputes produce all the time. Nobody in Washington took them seriously. The assumption inside the West Wing was the same assumption it had been making for months with every country it pressured: make the threat big enough, and the other side will fold. But something else was happening simultaneously at the level of ordinary Canadian citizens that no tariff model captures. Canadians began spontaneously boycotting American products and American travel. A poll from early 2025 found that 62% of Canadians plan to avoid traveling to the United States for the coming year. Canadian travel to the U.S. dropped 40% compared to the previous year, threatening an estimated $4 billion in annual U.S. tourism revenue from Canadian visitors alone. American bourbon disappeared from Canadian liquor store shelves, not because a government ordered it, but because Canadians stopped buying it. This was not manufactured nationalism. It was a genuine, ground-up expression of a population that had been insulted by tariffs, justified with fabricated emergencies, insulted by a president who called their country a suburb and suggested annexing it, insulted by the casual contempt embedded in the premise that Canada would simply comply because it had no choice. They had a choice, and they made it. What happened instead was that Canada elected a new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, a former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, on a platform explicitly built around standing up to the United States, not accommodating it, not managing it, standing up to it. Carney's first declaration upon taking office was simple and direct. The old relationship between Canada and the United States was over, ended by the Trump administration's own actions. And then, rather than simply defending against American pressure, Canada went on offense. Not militarily, not rhetorically, strategically, economically, diplomatically, in ways that started a chain reaction nobody in Washington had modeled for. The first link in that chain was Europe. Within months of taking office, Carney had made 5 multi-day trips to European capitals. Not one brief visit, 5 extended diplomatic missions to France, Germany, the United Kingdom, and Brussels. The contrast with his Washington engagement, a single brief visit, was not accidental. It was a message delivered in the language of diplomatic scheduling, which is one of the clearest languages governments speak to each other. At the 20th Canada-EU Summit in Brussels in June 2025, something happened that would have seemed inconceivable 18 months earlier. Canada and the European Union signed a formal security and defense partnership, a document that embedded Canada into European security architecture in a way that had no modern precedent for a non-European country. They committed to deeper cooperation on defense, digital technology, artificial intelligence, critical minerals, clean energy, and resilient supply chains. They began negotiations on a digital trade agreement to sit alongside the existing CETA trade framework. They launched an EU-Canada industrial policy dialogue. They created a strategic partnership on raw materials, covering rare earths, rare earth magnets, and critical inputs that the entire global tech and energy economy depends on. And then by December 2025, Canada went further. It became the first non-European country in history to join the European Union's SAFE program, the Security Action for Europe initiative, a €150 billion rearmament fund designed to rebuild European defense capacity. Canada's participation was unprecedented. It had never been offered to a country outside the EU or its closest associated partners. The fact that it was offered to Canada and that Canada accepted it sent a message that reverberated through every defense ministry in the Western world. The architecture of Western security, built entirely around American primacy since 1945, had just acquired a new pillar that didn't run through Washington. Prime Minister Carney went to Davos in January 2026 and declared from the most prominent economic stage on Earth a rupture in the global order. His words were precise and deliberate. He was not describing a trade dispute, he was describing a structural realignment. And within weeks of that speech, Canada signed a new strategic partnership with China, finalized a long-delayed investment deal with Qatar, and announced plans to travel to India to pursue additional trade agreements. The government's stated goal to double Canadian exports to non-US markets by 2035 had moved from aspirational to operational. The infrastructure of trade diversification was being built in real time. Now, here is where you need to understand why this matters far beyond Canada, far beyond North America, and far beyond whatever tariff number is currently sitting on any particular Canadian good entering the United States. What Canada did was demonstrate something that the entire post-Cold War international order had never been forced to test. It demonstrated that a wealthy, stable, Western, democratic country, one of America's closest allies, embedded in every major Western alliance from NATO to Five Eyes, could absorb American economic coercion, refuse to fully capitulate, and immediately find alternative partners willing to deepen their relationships precisely because Canada was standing firm. That demonstration has a name in international relations theory. It is called a credibility signal, and it is one of the most powerful forces in geopolitics. When a country under pressure holds its ground and builds alternative relationships rather than collapsing, every other country watching recalibrates its own assessment of what is possible. And dozens of countries were watching Canada very carefully. The European Union's acceleration of its own strategic autonomy agenda, something Brussels had been debating and delaying for years, was directly catalyzed by what happened to Canada. European officials watched the United States impose punishing tariffs on its most loyal neighbor using a legal justification that didn't hold up to scrutiny, and they drew the obvious conclusion: if it can happen to Canada, it can happen to us. The EU's push to deepen defense cooperation independent of American leadership, to secure its own critical mineral supply chains, to build its own digital sovereignty framework, all of it accelerated after February 2025. Canada's situation was the case study that made the theoretical argument concrete. Trade in goods between Canada and the EU had already grown by 65% since 2017 under the CETA trade agreement. After the US tariffs began, that growth accelerated further. Europe bought more Canadian canola, aluminum, and oil. The United Kingdom bought more Canadian unwrought gold as investors and central banks sought alternatives to the US dollar. Singapore and Indonesia saw surges in Canadian commodity sales. Canada's Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, which opened a pathway for Canadian oil to reach Asian markets for the first time at scale, set an all-time record for non-North American oil shipments in October 2025. The trade flows that Canada spent decades directing almost entirely southward were bending, visibly and measurably, toward new destinations. Foreign direct investment into Canada in 2025 reached $96.8 billion, the highest annual inflow since 2007. Read that number again in context. In the middle of a trade war with the world's largest economy, while absorbing tariffs on its most important exports, Canada attracted nearly $100 billion in foreign investment. The markets were voting, and they were voting for Canada as a stable, reliable, rule of law destination precisely at the moment the United States was demonstrating that it was not. Within Canada, the political landscape had been transformed in ways that will persist long after any individual trade dispute is resolved. The tariff war had done something that Canadian politics hadn't seen in decades. It unified a fractured country. Conservatives, Liberals, and NDP, parties that agreed on almost nothing, agreed on this. Canadian sovereignty was non-negotiable. Canadian data, Canadian resources, Canadian supply chains, these were not bargaining chips to be handed over in exchange for tariff relief. The political cost of appearing to capitulate to Washington had become so high that no Canadian politician from any party could pay it. That consensus is structural now. It will not dissolve when a trade deal is eventually signed. It will shape Canadian policy for a generation. The numbers inside Canada tell an equally striking story. Canada's economy shrank by 1.6% in the second quarter of 2025, largely because of falling exports. Unemployment ticked above 7%. Tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs were disrupted across the auto, steel, and lumber sectors, the same industries that had been the backbone of the most integrated supply chains on the continent. Quebec's premier warned that the province alone could lose up to 100,000 jobs if the tariffs held. Canadian businesses that had built their entire commercial model around north-south trade were scrambling to pivot east and west simultaneously, finding new buyers in markets they had barely engaged with before. The pain was real, deep, and distributed across the Canadian working class in ways that were visible and immediate. And yet the political response was not a demand for capitulation to Washington. It was a demand for more resistance. That is not the normal political economy of a trade war. That is something different. That is a population that had decided that the principle being defended was worth paying for. There is one more element of the global chain reaction that deserves attention because it is the most strategically significant and the least discussed. Canada's pivot toward Europe, and particularly its integration into European defense structures, is not just a commercial or political story, it is a security story. For 75 years, Canada directed 75% of its defense procurement spending toward American manufacturers. That figure, confirmed by Carney himself, represents an extraordinary level of defense dependency on a single supplier, a supplier that had just demonstrated it was willing to use economic coercion against its closest partners without credible justification. Canada began evaluating European fighter jets to replace aircraft it had previously planned to buy from the American firm Lockheed Martin. It embedded itself in European defense industrial programs through SAFE. It deepened intelligence and security cooperation with European partners through the new Security and Defense Partnership. These moves do not replace the foundational Canada-US security relationship, which remains essential for Arctic defense and continental security, but they reduce Canada's exclusive dependency on American defense suppliers in a way that will persist regardless of how US-Canada political relations evolve. And here, again, every ally watching drew their own conclusions. Australia, Japan, South Korea, and other American partners in the Pacific all watched Canada, one of the most traditionally loyal American allies on Earth, begin diversifying its defense partnerships away from exclusive American dependency. None of them accelerated away from Washington the way Canada did, but all of them updated their internal calculations about what might be necessary if American reliability continued to deteriorate. So where does all of this go from here? And this is the question that matters most, because the chain reaction Canada started is still moving. It has not reached its final destination. The most important scheduled event in the near term is the USMCA review in July 2026, the mandatory renegotiation of the trade agreement that governs commerce between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. This review was always going to be consequential. In the current environment, it is potentially historic. 3 scenarios are possible, and each one carries entirely different implications for the global order. In the first scenario, a genuine renegotiated deal emerges. Both sides make real concessions. The U.S. agrees to restore tariff-free treatment for Canadian goods across the major affected sectors. Canada agrees to adjustments on dairy access and perhaps certain digital governance questions. The relationship stabilizes, the worst of the trade war ends, and both countries begin the long process of rebuilding trust. This is the outcome that would be best for both economies, best for North American stability, and best for the global trade system. It is also the outcome that requires the most political courage. From both sides, courage to accept compromise in an environment where both governments have spent more than a year telling their domestic audiences that standing firm is a virtue. In the second scenario, the USMCA review produces a minimalist framework, enough to keep the agreement technically alive, but insufficient to resolve the underlying tensions. Tariffs remain on steel, aluminum, and certain other sectors. Canada continues building its European and Asian trade relationships as insurance. The relationship operates at reduced trust and higher friction indefinitely, neither fully repaired nor fully broken. This managed deterioration is the most likely scenario in the near term, and it is more damaging than it sounds because relationships that deteriorate slowly rarely announce the moment when they have deteriorated too far to recover. In the third scenario, the one that geopolitical analysts in every major capital are now gaming out in private, the USMCA review fails. The United States conditions the renewal of the agreement on demands that no Canadian government could politically accept: full dismantling of supply management in dairy, complete alignment of Canadian digital regulation with American tech company preferences, binding restrictions on Canada's ability to negotiate independent trade relationships with countries Washington considers adversarial. Canada refuses. The United States responds with the 100% tariff threat that Trump floated in January 2026. Canada's economy is hit hard. Canada formally deepens its trade integration with the EU and pursues its China strategic partnership with new urgency. The North American economic bloc that NAFTA and USMCA built over 30 years begins to fracture, not cleanly, not overnight, but structurally and permanently. If that third scenario plays out, the chain reaction Canada started will have produced something that no American strategist, no NATO planner, no global economist wanted to see: the separation of Canada from its position as the bedrock of the American continental system. Not a military separation, not a hostile separation, but an economic and strategic separation that leaves the United States more isolated, more dependent on its domestic market alone, and less able to exercise the kind of soft power that comes from being the indispensable center of a network of wealthy, stable, allied democracies. And the countries watching that scenario unfold in Europe, in Asia, in the global South will not see a cautionary tale about challenging American power. They will see a roadmap. Here is what this moment actually means, stripped of all the tariff numbers and diplomatic communiques and legal arguments about trade law. A country of 40 million people, facing economic pressure from the most powerful nation in human history, decided that it would not simply absorb the pressure and comply. It decided to build, to diversify, to deepen relationships that had always been secondary and make them primary, to signal to the world through actions, not just words, that the rules-based international order was worth defending, even when the country that had done the most to build that order was the one dismantling it. Canada did not win this confrontation. It is not over. The pain is real. Jobs have been lost. Industries have been disrupted. The economic cost of the tariff war is measured in real suffering for real people on both sides of the border. None of that is theater, but Canada held, and in holding, it showed every mid-sized democracy on earth that holding was possible, that the alternative partnerships existed, that the world had not run out of options. That sovereignty, when defended with strategy rather than sentiment, could be maintained even against the most powerful economic force ever assembled. The chain reaction that started on February 1st, 2025, with a tariff order signed in Washington, is still moving through Brussels and Berlin, through Beijing and New Delhi, through Tokyo and Canberra, through every foreign ministry on earth that is quietly updating its contingency plans for a world where American reliability is no longer assumed. Canada didn't start this, but Canada may have changed everything. The question now is not whether the world has changed, it has. The question is what the United States is going to do about a chain reaction it triggered but cannot control. And whether the answer to that question comes through negotiation at a table in July 2026 or through the kind of fracture that takes a generation to repair. What do you think? Has Canada's pivot made the world more stable by proving that alternatives to American dominance exist? Or has it accelerated a fragmentation of the Western alliance that ultimately makes everyone less secure? Drop your perspective in the comments. This is one of those conversations where every voice matters. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next chapter of this story is being written right now, and you do not want to be the last person to understand what is happening.